Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're doing a bonus episode on my Wuyi Revisited trip 2025, Return to Wuyi. Here to join me for this conversation is the editorial team, Patrick Penny.
Hey, hey.
And Zongjun Li.
Hello, hello.
At Zongjun, this was not one of the tea technique research trips. I was on a personal trip for a month in China, and I went to Wuyi and I wound up doing a bunch of tea things, and I wrote about it.
Yeah, I remember talking to you and kind of joking that this was just going to be your solo research trip, and you were like, no. I'm only going to do like one tea thing. Nancy will only let me get away with one tea thing. And lo and behold, 20 plus pages of trip report later, you did a ton of tea things. And this is one of a few different areas you went to and did tea stuff. So this was a huge solo tea trip. So really, just what the heck? Why'd you do this without us?
Well, 30 plus pages. Zongjun, you were invited to meet me in China, but
I was in China at the time, so good timing, man.
But 30 plus pages. We went to Chengdu and we did a bunch of tea stuff there. Went to Lushan and did a bunch of tea stuff there, Jingzhen. But the one that really stuck out, the one that I wrote about, was Wuyi. And it was a very different experience this time. I think that there was a clear level up in the level of preparation, who we know, who I know, who I was able to get introductions to. But there was also just a much better understanding of the terroir and what was going on in the local tea scene. I felt like I got clued into a lot more things that were still a bit on. We peeled back the curtain a little bit on our last research trip, and I feel like this time I really got to step behind the curtain and see some of the puppet mastery that goes on in Wuyi. I don't know I hope that's shown through on the trip report.
Definitely. I can tell that you got to do a ton more stuff. Speaking of connections and having a different level of connections, what was different this year? It's literally a year later. How did you make so many more connections in that 1 year or that short span of time?
Yeah. Primary contact is still someone who we met last year, just being there. You and I, Pat.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Wuyi is an interesting place, and a lot of people are seriously into tea, and a lot of people are very showy about being into tea. And just like anywhere, some of them are real Charan tea people with real access and deep roots in a place, and some of them showed up a year ago and bought some tea and opened up a street-facing shop. So you have to be quite careful and diligent about assessing who it is you're dealing with. But Pat and I got very, very lucky. And we met someone who turned out to be a true Charan. And it was towards the end of the trip last year. So we exchanged information, we shared some tea together. And then I spent a year really developing that relationship, sharing writing, exchanging some tea samples, exchanging tasting notes. This was a full court press on showing that I was serious while at the same time doing my diligence on who I was dealing with. So then I wrote back and I said, I'll come to Wuyi this year if you'll receive me. And I have other friends and other things to do there. But if you want to spend a few days drinking tea and showing me some of the work that you're doing, I would love to do that. And thankfully she said yes. And so that was really a key to serious access. And then we met with other people there. We met with our friends who do light roasting. I got new introductions to a legacy family that owns land and plots in the park that has historical production facilities and historical familial lands. That was a very kind introduction from another tea friend. And so just, the network in a way builds itself, but in other ways, it's definitely a concerted effort. And you need to be at a certain level, both in Chinese language skills and in your own tea knowledge, in order to be accepted and welcomed in a group like that. So I feel quite lucky in getting such access.
Yeah, and that new-ish contact that you had worked on over the last year. I saw Zongi looked a little confused when we were talking about this person, because I think Zongjin, I think you did meet her, but we didn't drink tea with
Yeah,
her
yeah.
until the night that you were dead.
We had some other beverages before with her. I do remember that. It was overly so at that point.
Now Cha murdered at that
Yeah.
point, dying in the hotel room, and Jason and I just like, let's go back to our usual place. And lo and behold, the whole time there was a Cha Ren there.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Other than connections being leveled up this time around, what do you feel like was one or two major things that were just different on this trip from our previous trip?
The weather. The park
I
wasn't
might have
closed.
been hinting for that one. Yes.
Yeah, park wasn't closed in flooding. That made a really big difference. And actually, when the park's not closed in flooding, it's possible to make some really great progress. Like you can really hike at a good clip through Huiyankang or Niulankang or any of the most of the great vistas and sites. They're pretty well paved and signposted. Although I will say, even in Wuyi, it is ridiculously hard to find a map of anything. There will be like one tiny trail map with no details when you get to a trailhead. And
Probably
there's,
on purpose.
yeah, and there is really no online maps of Wuyi. It is incredibly frustrating, but it is quite easy to get around. And, you know, when the park's not flooding, you can see a lot in even a pretty compressed time frame. We pretty frequently had afternoon meetings right after lunchtime. So wake up, hike through one of the areas of the park, grab a quick bite, and then go meet our contacts. So it was a pretty efficient way to do it. So that was one major difference. The other major difference is how much time I spent outside of the scenic area. We always think of Wuyi as this one contained, 60 square kilometer national scenic area, but actually the Wuyi Park is much, much larger than just the scenic area. And there's absolutely no infrastructure for tourists or for tea travelers, tea adventurers, whatever you want to call us, out there. So you have this whole network and bus system and trail system in the scenic area, and you have none of that outside the scenic area. There's no signposts. There's nothing telling you where you are. There's a bunch of guards and gates to prevent not just foreigners, but even Chinese nationals without the right permits and permissions. And so I spent a whole lot more time outside of the scenic area in the National Ecological Protection Area, looking at other great growing areas of tea that are also on Danxia landforms that don't have quite the name cachet, and in some cases are somewhat purposely unnamed or less named or less promoted than the scenic area itself.
So, you know, I think we'll talk a little bit more about outside the park and hear more of your experience about that as we go through our discussion. I definitely do want to hear about what you saw again this year that maybe kind of affirmed our findings from last year, what you saw this year within the park that maybe gave you some hope. Before we get to both of those, let's talk about verified references and why it's important to have a well-stocked wine closet of like DRC and Lafite Rothschild.
Domay Romanée Conti is difficult even for me to purchase. Rothschild, much more available.
No Zongjun to sell or trade for some DRC?
I'd consider it. Well, you know, a cake of Huangyin goes a lot longer than a bottle of DRC. I mean, my goes-to is Clos de la Roche. That's right there on the price, quality, availability scale in my book. But the thing is, and in the intention of the question is, what does it mean to have verified references, right? Without tasting wines like that, can you really say that you've had Grand Cru French wine? Can you really say that you've had God tier wine of any type? And the answer to that in many ways is no. The ability to pull out what's nuanced and what's special is a learned skill. And it's something that takes repeat exposure to flavor and repeat pathways of mind. Just like any sport, you perform as you practice. In tasting, you perform as you practice. You're only going to perform as well as your standards and your references. We joke about these Grand Cru wines, but at least in those cases, there is a somewhat agreed on ranking, right? No one's out there saying, oh no, Chateau Lafite Grand Cru Rothschild, that wine sucks. And I'm sure there's one person out there and you don't want to share wine with them. But generally, with few exceptions, the French AOC is considered to be acceptable, is considered to be something that you can trust, right? Everyone knows Chablis and first growth Chablis is better than cru Chablis, but that's due to weird reasons. Some people would argue some early climate change and differences in soil composition, other things. But, with the exception of stuff like that, you at least have this ranking system that you can trust and you can verify. With tea, there's nothing. And so a lot of people are getting Yancha that's either is Jinyang, but it's lower end Jinyang, burnt to the crisp, or river tea, or 1-year-old fresh planting, fertilized summer growth, and thinking that this is what the tea is supposed to taste like, or it's something that's Yancha style, grown from outside the core area or even the outer area, and doesn't have these telltale signs. And so you get into this situation where people are training themselves not just without references, but with no references. And it causes a very strange preference drift, and it causes people to miss out when they are exposed to great tea without being clued into what it is that makes a tea special. They're prone to miss out on the nuances that make the tea special. So I would say if there's anything to invest in, it's having verified and trustable references. And that is much, much harder with Yancha than it is with most other classes or types with tea. I would say that we've had teachers in the past who have broken out God tier Yancha in the past, but it was never something that we could ourselves have until this year, really leveling up from even the stuff that I thought was pretty good. We rate on a 7-point scale, things that we were giving 6s and 7s, and now that's gotten crunched down. What we have access to now is really a step up. So
we kind of feel the same way last time too, right? Like this kind of, I would say, ground truth almost become a secret teaching. Like there's no universal vocabulary or references for people to have like actual conversation with each other. It's almost like lacking a vocabulary system for people to communicate, because people are using basically different references that they see as truth. It might not be real Yancha, but the person, across the table might actually think that they had real Yancha or real Zhengyan, and that's what they believe in. And that's almost everyone is living their own simulacra, and they're talking over each other. It's very difficult.
It's certainly the case in the West. The thing that really at times bothers me is, when people dismiss Laotsong or dismiss the health of the environment, things that look pretty must be healthy. The idea that all of these products in disparate categories from different cultures around the world have placed value on old tree agricultural goods, right? Whether it's olives, whether it's grapes, whether it's agave, cactuses, whether it's heirloom older varieties of apples or pears or fruits, tobacco plants, right? All of these disparate, separate, differently incentivized cultures and idea cultures and agricultural systems have come to the same conclusion, that the older trees, the older plants offer something that the younger plants don't. And older plants are always going to be in the minority for tons of various reasons. But this idea that people trained on a Western palate and what's available in the Western market and Yancha are going to come in and say, oh, well, I tried some Laotsong and I didn't think it was really better or worth the price premium to the Shaoshu trees, right? That's what really gets me to go on a rant that, well, you haven't had Grand Cru Yancha, right? You don't have any verified references. You actually haven't even had what is real Laotsong. Do you actually know the age of the trees or where the trees were from or how those trees were processed? You still have fertilized Laotsong trees right by the main pathways. This is not one or nothing, but there's a whole system that goes into this promotion, and there's this whole system of knowledge that is particularly, even more than pu'er, particularly in Yancha, is focused on saying, hey, this is rare, this is special, this is something that you can't get again, and you should buy it from us because we're the ones who have it. And it's so very rarely true. If it was true, why would they be promoting it? Why wouldn't they sell it for double the dollar per gram? All right. In China, where, if you have it, you could sell it instantly. So that gets me pretty riled up.
Interesting. One thing that we did notice is how much fertilizer was used in the park area last time. And all of the plants were shooting out shoots in the middle of the summer day. And it was really, really unnatural to see how plants can behave like that. Do you see that kind of practice being used in other regions that you visit this time? Like outside of the proper park control area? Because in those areas, you are not necessarily allowed to plant new trees, right? So the only way you can boost up production is by boosting up per unit production.
Yeah.
You can only use the existing trees, but it's not necessarily the case elsewhere. Yeah.
So to the east is lower end non-Danxia. That's where you get like Wuyi style tea going east of Wuyi National Park. But going west, going particularly northwest, you get into some still Danxia landforms around the Nine Bend River, which stretches for kilometers and kilometers before even reaching the park. And that's in the Nine Bend Stream Ecological Protection Area, which hence the name. The ecological protection area has much stricter rules around what types of fertilizers and how much fertilizers and what you're allowed to plant. And then you have the National Nature Reserve, which is much higher altitude and much less tea is planted there. So going into the Nine Bend Stream Ecological Area, can you find places that have seriously tilled and fertilized and planted new plantations? Down by the river, you can. There's still river tea, right, which is never going to sell at a price premium. It's still going to be on floodplains. But once you're outside of the river, no, the levels of agricultural intensity and fertilization is less. It's not none. You still have people who are trying to make a living off of limited and constrained planting of tea, but you're much more likely to find individuals and entire villages that have collectively decided that they're going to go 100%, non-certified organic, but organic biodynamic, non-fertilization. The ideas in many of those villages is much closer to what we saw in Yiwu than it is to what we see in Wuyi village, Wuyi proper.
So how did people, because you worked, I think this time with a bunch of people who were not looking specifically at the Zhengyan area tea, but looking out at these areas that we were just discussing. How do they discuss these teas or talk about these teas or market these teas even? Obviously with you, they didn't have to market. They're just talking and tasting. But how do they approach this like as a business model? Because it's not Zhengyan tea and that's probably easy to talk about, but they have to build this nuanced story about why this tea is worth it or better or different.
Yeah, it's a good question. What happened when I was there is they would just cycle these teas onto the tasting. Start with the Zhengyan tea, then move to a different tea, and then move to a totally outside Zhengyan area. And it would just be side by side, one after another in sequence. And usually the introduction to a tea like that, and particularly as I started to get more and more clued into this, and having been on these trips, you guys know that I start every tasting with 100 questions. But, they would generally say, this is an ecological tea, or this is a natural environment tea. They were pretty specific about calling out the wholesomeness of the environment and being explicit that this is not from within the Zhengyan. So that was pretty. It wasn't something that was kept secret. It's almost an open secret amongst higher end Wuyi practitioners right now that the park is being over extracted. There's too much fertilizer, too many tea plants in too small of an area, which is not to say that there's no good park tea. There certainly is, but I think there's been an awakened realization about this. And maybe this might be going too far, but maybe this is now like when people in Yiwu or people who like Yiwu tea are now saying, oh, well, let's look in Laos, and people who like Mung Hai tea, let's look in Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, but maybe the Laos, maybe that's going a step too far. But the idea that there's more there, that they don't have to follow the strict definition of lines on a map, the map is not the territory, is, I think, really started to take hold in at least a portion of the tea world. Certainly not everyone.
Are there any new geographic identities slowly being formed, or have you observed any places being repetitively talked about?
Yeah, directly north of the park, like within
North
sight
of
of the park. Like you just see, like there's a whole very natural area directly north of the park. Like you can see it from the park, and everyone knows that area. Everyone likes that area. That's basically considered to be true Shenyang, despite being outside of a line on a map. But that one's held differently because that one's been that way for like 15, 20 years.
huh. Is it like a new Zhenyan kind of a
Yeah, like New
situation?
Zhengyang. Yeah, like Zhengyang North. But everyone knows that one's not hidden in secret and fun discovery. That's like, okay, it's that spot.
Oh yeah, that place. Interesting. So over those tasting sessions, other than, your contact, auditarians and maybe their friends, were there any buyers or like consumers being part of the tasting? And if so, like what were their opinions?
They had some other non-local friends who at various points had joined us. But I would say that those non-local friends were they took more of a role of pure student. They tended to just accept what the teacher in that case and the primary contact was saying. But there were a lot of them who were very dedicated to Yancha, people who come back every year to harvest, to buy, to taste. Yeah, it was quite a nice group of people. Outside of that, when I was not with the core Charan group that I know, what I mostly saw was, like walking into a random coffee tea house in Wuyi. Actually, it's really fun, weird experience to go and drink coffee in Wuyi. Really high-end coffee shops in Wuyi Village tourist town directly across from the Shenyang.
Wait, really?
Could you?
Well, we had gone to like one place last year that was okay. I don't think we found too much great coffee. What did you find this year?
No, I found a better one. Actually, I don't think it was the same place. Was it like a brutalist place?
It was near our friend's bar and super strange.
Yeah, it leveled up, and now
Okay.
great Yunnan coffee. Yeah, it was pretty good. But going there, even places like that have tea, right? And so of course, like, okay, I order coffee when we order a tea. So one tea, one coffee. Coffee's pretty good, a higher end Yunnan coffee, and the tea was by U.S. standards, amazing, by random whole leaf tea in China standards. If I was not in a tea place, I'd say it's not terrible. But, to be in Wuyi and drinking that, it was a bit charry, it was a bit crunchy. It had some well-developed Maillard's reaction caramelization going. It was sweet from the baking. These are the nicest things I could say about Young Tree Shui Xian burnt to a crisp. Was it real Wuyi? I mean, I didn't get a headache from it. I didn't feel any jaw tightness. My throat didn't clench, right? I didn't sit down the whole tea. But was this good tea? No. I guess part of the reason that I bring this up is because the idea of what is good is a difficult question, even in Wuyi, even from people who are there, right? And so I have my thermos with me. I grabbed out a packet of my tea and asked for some boiling water for the thermos. And it was like, oh, actually, do you have a scissor? Can you open the tea? She opens the tea. She takes a big smell of it before putting it in the thermos. And she's like, oh, pretty good. It was like, that's better.
Game, respect, gain.
Yeah, game was a game. It was funny.
That's neither toe or show.
It's just interesting that, that they weren't serving great tea, and yet the person behind the bar could tell that a tea that I was carrying around myself was superior. So it's pretty difficult to have an understanding of the skill levels that's going on. I would say somewhere there was a whole big group of Europeans that went on some tea making experience in Wuyi. And then they were out drinking beer at night, and you could hear them and carrying on. And it seemed like a nice enough group, right? I didn't talk to them. I don't know what group it was, but it was also pretty clear from just who they were with that they were being taken on a tea making tour, and they were all going to go home with some tea, but it wasn't going to be primo, you know, $3+ a gram Zhengyang tea.
They might be actually end up paying for that price.
They might have paid $3 a gram.
So I think last year we had almost nothing but negative things to say. This time you had a much better experience and your takeaways are quite different. Where do you frame Wuyi in your relation to it now and how you see yourself approaching it as we go forward and potentially go back for another research trip?
Yeah, we definitely have to go back for another research trip. Wuyi is such a hard one because so many people have such a stake in the mythology and the hyper real and the merchant myths of it. I think something that really stood out to me, and you started to talk about this, Patty, you hinted at the question, was just back to back going Yiwu to Wuyi and seeing the difference in nature, the level of difference in the natural environment and the care for the land makes it really difficult to openly approach and accept the common practices in Wuyi. There's a real sense of the difference in just the agricultural practices. It's hard to take claims of terroir superiority seriously if they're ripping up the trees every 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, no longer than 30 years, laying down young trees that are going to start to be harvested in 2 years, doused with fertilizer. It's difficult to take this idea of the superior terroir seriously, which again, I keep going back to, it's not to say it doesn't exist. It does. It's just not available. It's just, you can't buy it at almost any price, right? You have to know a guy who knows a guy. You have to have, family connection. You have to be a repeat buyer. Even if you were willing to pay 2 or 3 or 5 times what someone else was willing to pay, they have other people that are willing to bid it up, and they're more likely to be consistent buyers. They'd be people who have been buying from them for the last decade or longer and have kept up with the price increases. So why would they take tea away from them for that relationship? We have the same problem with Danju. We can't just waltz up and be like, we'd like some Mensong Danju. Dude,
We can, but just like all the other Laoban who do that, we'll end up with some random Danju tree that might not actually be what you hope to pay for when you're paying for Danju.
yeah. I mean, that's true. That's true. If we go to Guofungjai, we'll get a quote unquote Danju tree, but Mensong, I don't think we'll get anything.
Some Lao Paka.
This looks a little different. This is some crunchy leaves. So, Jason, there's on my mind at least 2 more things I need to ask about, and you can combine this answer, but what was the Shaokao scene like this time? And what's the deal with Papaya?
Yeah, we'll come back to Papaya. Actually, before we move on to those questions, I wanted to ask you guys, because I've been doing a lot of the talking, not being on this trip, reading the trip report. What was it that stood out to you? It was just a year since we were there together, and this was so different. And I hope you think it was a well-researched, well-thought-through report. But what was the takeaways that you got from it, and what is different about your takeaways having been there just a year ago versus the readership? What is the readership not seeing when they haven't set foot in the Zhengyang themselves?
Yeah, I think for me, damn, what a difference a year makes. Like, I wish I was on this research trip with you and not the last one, but reading through this report, I think gave me a lot of hope on what the Wuyi book could look like. I think after we came out of the trip last year, I was like, how the fuck are we going to write a book about this? Like, how do we even continue to learn about this? And so it was really good to see, not only through the better connections, the access to better tea and better reference points, but I think a better understanding of kind of the ecosystem. And I don't mean that just environmentally, but the ecosystem of merchants and negotiants, right? And that exists beyond just the Zhengyan and how the broader area of this national nature reserve plays a part in the tea and the tea culture coming out of the Wuyi area. And so I'm really interested to continue to learn more about this like outer park in a positive way, because usually that term is used negatively, right? Outer park in a positive way. I'm interested to get a chance to taste some of these teas and learn more about these. But I think for people who have never been to Wuyi, reading hopefully last year's trip reports and then this year's trip reports, I think we were pretty clear last year that we know that there was more to learn and we didn't quite have the exact access we want yet. And I hope that they can kind of see what that development looks like. And through listening to our discussion today too, I think just the kind of effort that needs to be put in consistently to attain these kind of networks and how this isn't just Pat, Jason, and Zongjun show up to some tea place and suddenly have a magical trip where we learn everything you need to learn and we're enlightened and we have the best access to tea in the world. It doesn't happen that way. It never happens that way. Some trips are better than others, but Wuyi was a struggle last year, and I'm glad to see it wasn't a struggle for you this year. And I just can't wait to see what it looks like when we go back next time.
It's sometimes really feel a little bit like that in some other trips, but really not Wuyi. Wuyi feels really deep water. At least that's how I felt last time. And reading this year's trip report from Jason, I actually view it a little bit more negative than you, Pat, in a way that it really reinforced a lot of our experience last time. Still, like all of the, I would say, highly intervened agricultural practices and how soil depletion is really a thing, not just inside the park, but, really across other regions as well. And the true good tea, the true terroir, it does exist, which is very hopeful, but not easily be able to get access to them is really, I would say, pained for us and for other people too. Because in a way, it's really a indicator of a internal argument, potential internal argument, or a difficult conversation with other people in the future, in a way that the knowledge that we end up learning might not be necessarily common knowledge. It's really hard to form meaningful conversation with other people in that sense, because frequently you would be able to foresee that, oh, okay, this conversation is not going anywhere because they haven't had the same experience as us would in many ways.
It already happened. The trip report got picked up in a few spots and discussed, and some people were quite negative on it.
Yeah. I don't know. It definitely feels very different than Pu'er and Dancong and other tea regions that we have visited. And I would say the amount of capitals and attentions being paid in this area is also on a different level than our tea production region. Because like all of the opinions being held or being preached in Wuyi has very, very intense real world consequences. And there are a lot of money being involved, and the people obviously wanted to hold very strong opinion on certain things if they are selling tea, for example, or if they are already paying a lot of tuitions and they don't necessarily want to see them being challenged.
Yeah, you pay $8 a gram for prime Yulan Kong, and you say, no, this is the best tea.
Without ever stepping foot in Yulankang and seeing what the agricultural processes look like there. I'm not saying for the entirety of Yulankang, but for a lot of what I've seen. It's interesting, and I'm sure other people, like vendors, probably feel this way, right? They have a very different incentive than us, but being in these places and admittedly in certain areas having better context than others and better access in some places than others, but being in these places, seeing an experience, sharing it, and then seeing some people online go like, no, I don't think they know what they're talking about. Like, you feel free to rock up to Wuyi whenever you want and let me know if you have a different experience. I hope you do have a different experience than I had last year. I hope you have an experience close to what you had this year, Jason, but I doubt you will.
Yeah, sign up for a tea tour first.
Yeah, you'll have a great time on a tea tour. You'll learn so much totally unfiltered information.
Yeah, it's a bit of good luck. I think you spend more time on some of the online tea places than I do, Pat, but
it's a dark world.
What do you think the response is going to be? Both Western and Chinese, right? We do have a good readership now in China. All of our Charan friends out there get access to the book. And in my view, our friends in China are generally more positive than the flyby commenters in the United States.
Yeah, hopefully this report is further helpful context on how to mentally frame up Wuyi, particularly if you never plan on going, right? If you don't think you're going to have the chance to go to China and have the opportunity to visit Wuyi, hopefully this is just helpful context. It doesn't have to shape your buying, but just have some of the things we're saying in the back of your mind, that the access that you have is limited in some ways and the education you have is limited in some ways, and hopefully we're supplementing it. But I think we know that our readership is very niche, and we know we don't always make the biggest waves with the things we put out there. I'll be happy to see all sorts of comments, however people want to talk about it, good or bad, as long as they're talking about it.
Anyone who wants to spend $4 plus per gram could do themselves a favor and read 30 pages on the tea they're buying.
You would hope so. Maybe their time is worth more than money. I don't know.
Ignorance is bliss. It's better not to know.
Just buy the DRC and the Lafitte Rothschild.
What were you going to say, Zongjun?
No, I was going to make a matcha joke, but might be too mean. I wouldn't wish that to my worst enemy.
No, we saw what it did to you last year, so just know we suffer for the readers and listeners' great benefit.
Yes, we did. Have either of you been drinking Yancha anytime recently?
Dude, like not at all. I think the last Yancha I had might have been when we were in Kunming with our merchant friend. I literally have been drinking pu'er nonstop, Yiwu pu'er. That's been like it.
Yeah. Same here, same here. Too many good pours to go through.
A dance song here or there, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Some Japanese green tea. I don't know. It's been real random.
How about you?
Well, leading up to this trip and then on the trip, but my tendency is certainly towards Yiwu. And then if I do a more serious sequence tasting on a Saturday, then what do I reach for on Sunday is dancehall. One of the reasons that I've been doing the talk taste triage, that I did them thematically for the last few, is to force myself to actually set up a sequence tasting of Yancha. Because I was like, it's kind of expensive. Maybe I'll just have one. But then I use different kettles and different wares for Yancha. So I'm not on my Tatsubin. I'm on my Shadiao and soak different teapots. So it feels like a big chore.
Did you discover any like good yancha that's at a more affordable price range and still good this trip?
That's a good question.
Because like I feel like that's really something that is preventing people from getting into a habit of drinking yancha more often.
Yeah. No, I would say everything I grabbed was very expensive. So much so that at first I thought that some of the the 9-bend ecological areas teas would be cheaper or at least more affordable, but they really weren't. Particularly
No.
to
Okay.
similar, no, particularly they still came in anywhere from 150, the ones that I bought from 150 upwards of $4 per gram. And there were definitely teas that were fully handmade from unnamed areas that were priced above that I didn't purchase. And I think what's happened, and I talked about this a little bit in the trip report, is that particularly in these very ecologically focused areas, it's the same people often making the tea. Either they have tea makers there who are legacy tea makers, or it's the same people who's making the Zhengyan tea. And when they then bring this super ecological tea from outside the Zhengyan, from the 9-bend stream ecological area, usually they insist on it being fully handmade, 100% handmade, no machine use at all. Because it's not Zhengyang, right? They need a different claim, and there's not that much of the tea if it's truly in an ecological area. So some of the machines don't really totally make sense to use. It'll be too rough on the tea in a small batch. And so it winds up being fully handmade. So actually the price comes up pretty high. But on the other hand, I think it's great. Like that type of yancha from an ecological area, totally handmade, it's wonderful. I think that pretty often hits a home run on the things that not just intellectually appeal to me, but the flavors that tasting it blind, it would score above half handmade or fully machine made Zhengyan 9 out of 10 times, comparing cultivar to cultivar, maybe or maybe not Laotsong, but a lot of those ecological areas are Laotsong.
So I think it's important we get back to Shaokao and papayas.
We need any Shaokao.
Good call.
After our Kunming experience, which is a repeat experience for me, it's so hard to eat Shaokao anywhere.
Yeah, not even worth going out for it.
No, and Zongjun really hyped up Xi'an, and I know Xi'an has great Shaokao and has different spice, and it's as good. And I got to Xi'an, and I have to tell you, Shaokao there sucked.
Okay, so Zongjun made his excuses for it already in the last Yiwu wrap up.
Yeah, he did. He did. They banned charcoal in the walled city. And then even outside the city, you have to go somewhere the government can't see the smoke.
Shaokao speakeasy.
Shaokao speakeasy, what it felt like. No, I don't know, Kunming something else. The second part of that question, papaya. That's a good question. Why did we need a 2-page endnote about the history of the papaya?
I don't know if need is even the right question, but why did you want to put a 2-page endnote about the history of papaya?
I didn't want that, got added because of editorial misdirection. So maybe Zongjun can explain, but mugua, which in more common parlance, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's actually a very old term. Really predates the contemporary interpretation of mugua or papaya nowadays by a few thousand years. And at the time, it really refers to something very different. It actually refers to multiple different plants across different dynasties. The definition changed, but it was really until very recently that the real papaya, the mugua that we are eating nowadays, got introduced into China, that people associate that term with papaya.
That's the fake papaya. That's the fan mugua.
The fan mugua, foreign papaya, the Laowai papayas.
The thing is, by no means am I a native speaker, but I put in the work and do the research. So it's interesting when there's someone's going to read some of these older translations that I do. And it was almost sad in a way. Zongjun insisted on simplified Chinese. Most of our translations are in simplified Chinese, although this is from...
It's really for SEO optimization. It was
really can find it.
And also, obviously, for traditional character readers, reading simplified version, it's easier than the other way.
It's a Qing Dynasty travel log of someone who visited Wuyi, because what trip report can be complete without comparing it to a earlier dynastic reference?
As we always do.
And it talks about a cultivar that I don't believe is extant anymore. I've never heard of mugua cultivar Yancha. Have you, Zongjun?
No.
No, I don't think it's extant anymore, but someone tried to sell me that mugua is papaya and that it should be translated as papaya. And that really bothered me after spending hours and hours and hours and hours on a research and a translation to find this travel log, track down the specific cultivars that have since died out. And so I wrote a 2-page endnote about the history of the papaya and the lexical shifts in the term mugua, and partially motivated so that I don't get any further wrong corrections, and partially motivated because I really like papaya fruit, favorite fruit. It's true.
All about that papaya milk.
So thank you, everyone. That's all the time that we have for today. Thank you for joining us in this special edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us for our next conversation, where we will hopefully be returning to our regularly scheduled programming. We have a great chapter coming up on shipwreck Yixing wares. We'll be resuming more regular cadence in book publications. And thank you all for being along for the journey. We could be doing this amongst ourselves, but doing it with you along for the ride means a whole lot. So thank you and good night.